All right, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the CDG Natural History Protocol at NIH, which is 5 years old, actually in its 6th year now, and so we have a lot of good information that we can share. I want to tell you a little bit about the NIH Clinical Research Center because I think a lot of people don't really understand how is NIH different than the care you might get at an academic medical center. So the first thing is this is the only 100% research hospital in the world. All the patients seen at NIH must be part of a research protocol. So you can't just call us up and say, I'd like to make an appointment with Dr. So-and-so and drive up, park your car, and come to clinic. There's no emergency room, although we do have other resources available. But if our patients are really too sick to be managed at NIH, we do transfer them to community-based resources. So for example, sick children would be transferred to Children's National in DC. There's no billing to third-party payers or to patients. And the nice thing is that we do have campus housing for patients and families either at the Children's Inn or at the Safra Lodge. So when you come to NIH to be part of a research protocol, we pay for all of your travel, your housing, your food, and we really work hard to use taxpayer dollars wisely. The study objectives included delineation of clinical and laboratory findings of CDGs, employ medical and family histories, consults, physical exams to advise patients and physicians about the diagnosis, prognosis, and therapy for CDGs, which obviously when we started, there was one treatable CDG. We're up to maybe 6 definitely, and lots of new therapies, which I know you guys have heard about over the last couple of days. We also can do skin biopsies for fibroblast cultures and lymphoblast cultures for RNA and DNA studies to look at the basic defects of CDGs. And we can collect samples from parents, carrier samples, which 2 years ago a lot of our researchers really wanted, and we do have available. And we wanted to use our protocol to recruit patients for potential new future therapeutic studies. And so now it's getting exciting. So we need a lot of data to make a really good admission. Marla, can you stand up for a minute? Marla is the CDG research nurse who works with me at NIH. Many of you may be harassed by her because she is the point person for collecting the data. So I want to go over that carefully to be sure, especially as we move into the consortium, that you understand how critical it is that you help us to get as much information about your child and your family as possible as we move forward. So most institutions will have some type of an admission checklist that says there are certain criteria that must be met prior to you being able to come to their institution. So here I'm showing you our primary pre-admission checklist. And it's important because it takes us 3 to 4 months to plan a good admission. As you'll see as I keep going, there is a lot of consultants and coordination for procedures that has to happen. And we will not even begin the planning process unless all of the records that we need are in hand. We share previous evaluations with our consultants so that they can plan ahead if there's any special diagnostics that they think your child or your family member would need. And I should say, because this question comes up a lot, our protocol is across the lifespan. We can see patients as young as 1 and as old as 80. And for patients younger than 1, we have an alternative protocol that we can use for them to still characterize a CDG. And for patients between 1 and 3, Depending on what exactly we're going to do, we may have an abbreviated admission and then see them back sooner than expected for some other things. In research, we call our standard collection tool a database, but truly what we're talking about is a case report form. And case report forms generally contain a lot of information about the subject, which would be your child or you if you're an adult patient. And when you look at how this looks, let's see if it shows, you can tell that we spend a lot of time going through all of your records and summarizing every single lab test, diagnostic test, birth history, developmental history. You will have a very long phone call with one of our research assistants or Marla to fill in blanks that we can't find from the medical record. And so this information runs somewhere between 10 and 14 pages generally. And we usually ask families, what is your wishes for the NIH experience as well? Because sometimes we can answer questions that haven't been able to be answered by other means. Takes a village, as you guys already know, of multiple specialists, and I know you've heard that multiple times. But in order to coordinate all of this into this extremely busy week-long admission, we really have to be able to give everybody ample time to tell us if certain consultants are on vacation, or if somebody is at a meeting, or if there is, a shortage of technicians in the MRI suite at a certain time in order to plan it, which is why we work so hard for so many months before we bring you in. So at 5 years, what we identified in about 75 patients total was our female-male split was even. Traditionally, in most CDGs, there's been a tendency to feel that there is more of a tendency to see males with CDGs, or at least more severely impacted, and we have not found that. 60% of the population is white, and we sort of expected that. 8 of our patients were Asian, 4 were mixed racial, 2 African American, and 8 patients self-identified as Hispanic. There were no Alaskan Natives or American Indians, at least in this first 5 years. And so we'll see how that continues to look, because we expect CDGs to be pretty pan-ethnic. So we have lots of flexibility at NIH, so we can obtain studies that may not be clinically indicated or are difficult to get locally, and that's because we're not billing insurance. So we don't have to get prior authorizations, we don't have to write letters of medical necessity. If we feel like a test is indicated, we do the test. So this includes a lot of research and clinical lab testing, lumbar punctures, combined sedated procedure days that last about 3 hours, sleep studies. We also can use the exact same staff, and we have an order set so that every case, every patient we see gets exactly the same information interpreted the same way by the same people, and that decreases our inconsistent data collection, which negatively impacts on the research that we then look at and try and move forward. We can also look at CDG animal model data and validate it in the human. So for example, in NGLE1, we had a question about abnormal stomach acid or dysmotility because the fly model has severe abnormalities in the gut. And we were able to prove that in the human that's not the case. And so it's just as important to prove a positive as it is to prove a negative, because we all know humans are not flies. But sometimes our animal models, as you heard from Andy, are really critical in how we're trying to understand these disorders and move towards therapy. We can send samples to clinical labs to strengthen interpretation of subtle biochemical abnormalities, which won't necessarily be done in the academic setting, right? So if you're billing insurance and you want to send a test out, you send a test because it's clinically indicated and your insurance approves it. But we wanted to be sure that labs that were looking for biochemical evidence of CDGs all around America actually were picking up even some of the more rare types. And so we routinely will send CDG testing to several different labs. And that's something that you would never see outside of a research setting. And so what that has done is provided what's called positive data to the labs that are doing clinical testing so that if they see the same pattern again, they can say, oh, yes, this definitely must be MAGT1 or a different disorder. New and rare disorders can be characterized by co-enrolling on other protocols, so we take advantage of lots of collaborators within NIH and also outside of NIH to look at some of the more rare or even new types of CDGs, like I've listed there. So findings so far, we've published an NGLE1 urinary biomarker. We've identified multiple treatable neurotransmitter abnormalities across all CDG types. We've clarified that the demyelinating peripheral neuropathy in PMM2 can be seen as early as 2 years of age, and that had never been documented previously. We've identified abnormal cholesterol metabolism in GPI anchor disorders, which may lead to a therapeutic approach using a statin. We found treatable obstructive sleep apnea or restless leg syndrome across all CDG types in very young and in our older patients. We've identified overlap with mitochondrial symptoms across multiple CDG types, including elevated CKs, aminoaciduria, lactic acidosis, white matter changes on MRI. And the mitochondrial proteins are pretty much all O-linked glycosylated. And the mitochondria and the endoplasmic reticulum actually move together in the cells and come apart over time, sharing different proteins. So we think this is part of what is causing these types of symptoms. We've identified auditory processing defects, that would be sensory neurohearing loss across multiple CDG types. And we've identified carnitine deficient reversible liver disease, that should be 2, in 2 PMM2 patients, but that's made us be very careful about checking all of our patients with different CDG types that have liver disease because carnitine supplementation is easy. Our diagnostic flexibility also includes our ability to have what we're calling cohort focuses, so we can work towards collecting data on a subset of patients with a specific goal in mind that services that population and moves the research forward in other ways. So the first cohort was NGLE1 and the second was PMM2, and then sort of simultaneously or very close behind PMM2, we looked at a bunch of GPI anchor disorders. Now we have a huge collaboration with the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease looking at MAGT1 CDG, formerly known as X-Men. And X-Men syndrome was considered to be a B-cell immunologic disorder characterized by lymphomas and leukemias and was not considered to be a systemic CDG. However, now we know that they do have neurologic findings, white matter changes on their MRIs, splenomegaly, elevated CKs, and other findings similar to other types of CDGs. And if you saw Janice's poster, my research IRTA that was here, we have a small cohort right now of SALA disease patients. So SALA disease is actually a storage disease, but those patients have low sialic acids and low galactic acid, and so it's sort of a secondary CDG. But the reason that we are looking at 5 to 6 of those patients is because they were trying to get a pilot study started in an academic medical center, and because no pilot study had ever been done, and because Dr. Husing, who I think you guys all heard, is a sialic acid expert in Dr. Gall's lab, it was decided if we could bring in just a handful of patients, collect all of our data, and then they can use that data as a pilot study to prove the need for their own independent natural history study. There are big challenges. So the NIH budget is funded by Congress annually, and 90% of that budget is for extramural research, such as the consortium. So academic medical centers will apply for multiple research grants, and that funding comes out of the designated extramural part of the budget. 10% of the NIH budget annually is for the intramural budget, which is what pays for Marla and I. And so you can already figure out that the percentage of money that goes to the intramural side is much, much lower for the research that we do than what happens on the extramural side, outside of NIH. And to make matters worse, when there is a collaboration like the consortium, the intramural group will not be able to access any support from the grant. So the CDG consortium has funding that we will not be able to utilize. So that means we're really not going to change much of what we are currently doing. So there's limited full-time CDG staff. Most notably, my real job is as the site coordinator for the Undiagnosed Diseases program. I do CDG stuff on the side. It's something that I love. I've done before I even came to NIH. I have a boss who supports my ability to do that after my real job is done. Limited number of physicians and nurse practitioners slow how fast we can bring patients in and how many patients we can actually see in a year. So right now we see 12 to 13 patients a year. I don't see that changing in the foreseeable future, do you? We don't have a good idea how we're going to contribute best to the new CDG consortium. I think the team at NIH is still talking about that. And the other challenge has been families that travel outside of the United States, because we can't cover travel until you're at a port of entry. So, you know, our European families, if they fly into New York or DC, anything after that we can take care of, but we can't get them from Portugal to Washington, DC, for example. Nor can we get patients from South America or Mexico. So those families have to be able to get themselves to the United States, and then we can take care of everything else. So we've thought a lot about how to do more with what we have for limitations. And so the first solution was to obtain funding to hire a research nurse, which we did, yay! And we are using a fair chunk of non-medical staff. So at NIH, we have a position called an IRTA. Those are intramural research funded grantees that are usually post-baccalaureate educated, pre-med students that work with us for 2 years sometimes 1, sometimes 3, but average is 2. And they can do as much as possible to free up physicians and nurse practitioners for the activities that only we can do. And we have continued to work to recruit a biochemical genetics fellow that NIH has anyway to do research time with the CDG protocol. How you can get us. So we now actually have a glycosylation at NIH.gov shared website, or shared email account, sorry. So the glycosylation at NIH.gov email is monitored by Marla, myself, our IRDAs, and primarily your first contact, if you go to that email address, will be Marla. And I just want to leave with a number of pictures of our patients and clinical teams. This is Tara and Janice, who are our most recent IRDAs. And we also support their research as part of their helping us keep this protocol running. And that was it, because I thought there might be a bunch of questions.